Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
David Cay Johnston is an investigative journalist and author, a specialist in economics and tax issues. He was the winner of the 2001 Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting. David's books include Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and The Fine Print. His most recent book is The Making of Donald Trump. David, welcome back to the program. I'm so glad you're here, man.
Well, thank you for having me on again, Coy.
So,
nice to be with you.
Congratulations on the book. And I want to begin by saying you, David, are the perfect person to write the book about Donald Trump because for those who don't know you, you have been writing about and covering Donald Trump for a long, long time. And you are arguably the journalist who knows him best. Take us back, David, and tell us when Donald Trump first came across your desk.
Well, in June of 1988, I left the Los Angeles Times, where I had been exposing the LAPD's worldwide undercover political operation and other stuff, and I went to the Philadelphia Inquirer to cover the gambling industry in Atlantic City, because I believed that we were about to see casino gaming take off across America, which it did, and I wrote a book about it called Temples of Chance. And right off the bat, Coy, a couple of days of being in town, I met Donald Trump, who was the dominant economic force in Atlantic City, and recognized that he was P.T. Barnum. He, come buy a ticket to see the amazing Fiji mermaid and the two-headed woman. What was astonishing to me was that as I talked to executives of other casinos, his own executives and other people, law enforcement people, I kept hearing the phrase, Donald is not an operator. And I would say, what does that mean? And they would say, well, he doesn't know anything about the casino business. He doesn't know the games. He doesn't know the odds. He doesn't understand customer development. And I thought that's crazy. I mean, this is just, they're all talking this guy down until I sat down for the first time to interview him, and I fed him false information, something investigative reporters are known to do to test people, and he proceeded to embrace all my falsehoods, and it became very clear he really didn't understand the casino business at all. All he knew was there were reports on how much cash was being generated, and he was withdrawing cash just as fast as he could. Donald has done a really remarkable job of selling the public an image of himself which has no connection to a robust public record of lawsuits, testimony under oath, official government findings, letters he's written, what's in his books, and I've read all of them, speeches that he has given. And let me give you one of them that should be very shocking to people. A lot of pastors have endorsed Donald Trump and called him a fine Christian man. Donald goes around saying nobody reads the Bible more than Donald Trump. Well, every time he's been asked to cite a passage from the Bible, he gives the same answer. Well, there's so many, because he doesn't know any. The one time he tried, and I recount this in The Making of Donald Trump, he got it wrong. Furthermore, and I think highly relevant to all of this, in a chapter in one of his books that I quote at length, and in a profanity-laced speech that he gave in Colorado in 2005, and in other forums I don't cite because it's enough to make the point, he denounces those people who follow the teachings of Jesus Christ and calls them fools and idiots and schmucks. And in the last case, it's clear that he means the most vile Yiddish definition of that word. He says that people who turn the other cheek, Matthew 5:39 to 45, are these folks. They're fools and idiots. And he says his personal philosophy is get even and get revenge. He has written and spoken at length about how what gives him joy in life is destroying the lives of other people. And his view that if Donald Trump's view is that if he asks you to do a favor, and if you were to say to him, as he tells a specific story about somebody about this, I can't do that. It would be unethical. His response is that you have now attacked him. And he says his mission in life is to destroy yours. And he tells about a woman he fired, and then he said her husband left her, and he went, that made me happy. And then she started a business, and when it failed, it made me even happier. And then he says he found out she'd lost her home, and he said he was just happier than he could imagine at this. And he says, and I go out of my way to make her life miserable. He says that if you insult him, he should hit you in the face 15 times. This is not Christianity. This is antithetical to Christianity. And yet he's getting a lot of votes from people who don't know this, because on the campaign trail he deceives them with flattery and he beguiles pastors.
I've talked to other historians and authors who have made clear, based on their research, that what we are witnessing today in America in the candidacy of Donald Trump is a demagogue that is remarkably similar to all the great demagogues in the human story. And we could go down the list, which is not to say that he is them, but that he employs very similar techniques, and that as a public speaker, as a political leader, that he subscribes to the same playbook that these classic demagogues often have in the past in some of the world's most tragic tyrannies. What's your view on that? I know you've written about that and you've thought about this before, but Donald Trump as demagogue, is there truth to that? Do you buy that?
Oh, yeah. Well, let me make two observations about that. The first one is about when Trump announced he was running for president this time on June 16th, 2015. I watched it live as he did it, and I was at the time the only national journalist who said, this time he's serious. Trump has talked about running for president since 1985. He asked George H.W. Bush to have him be his running mate in 1988. Instead, we got Dan Quayle. And during his speech, where he talked about Mexicans as murderers and rapists and attacked Muslims and other people, he got interrupted by applause 43 times. Now, you know, that's kind of a strange thing, since he announced at Trump Tower, which is in Midtown Manhattan, a place not exactly known for bigotry and racism and xenophobia. I mean, if anything, it's ground central for what Trump calls political correctness. Where did he get these fans? Well, it turns out they were actors paid $50 each.
Are you kidding?
So his campaign was born in fraud. Now, let me go to the second part about the demagoguery. As you know, because you've had me on your show, I wrote a trilogy of best-selling books, one of which won the Investigative Book of the Year award, about how little-known government policies take from the pockets of poor and middle-class and moderately well-to-do people and put them in the pockets of select people way up the income ladder. Perfectly Legal showed how the tax system does this. Free lunch was about subsidies to big companies and rich people like Warren Buffett. And the fine print was about monopolies and blocking competition in the marketplace. So my critics have said that I'm the one who's to fault for people thinking inequality is an issue in America, because I'm wrong. It's really not an issue. Well, I think it really is an issue, but I'll take the blame that I'm the guy who made this an issue in America. So along comes Donald Trump, who seizes on this issue of inequality and says, I alone can fix this. And the reason that you're in this terrible shape is because of the other. It's the Mexicans, it's the Chinese, it's the idiots in Washington, it's the generals who don't know what they're doing. I know what to do. I alone can save you. Well, that's classic demagoguery, and it also has nothing to do with the real issues about why the bottom 90% of Americans on their tax returns in 2014 reported an income, once you adjust for inflation, 1% higher than in 1967. I mean, think about that. 47 years go by, and the average income of the bottom 90% of Americans in real terms goes up 1%. There's no growth in the bottom 90%. And we had some growth for a while. We had it in the late 90s. We had it briefly around 2006-07, but otherwise we haven't until last year when we had the largest growth recorded in decades, clear back to the 1920s. But Trump isn't talking about that, and he's not proposing to address any of the issues that actually would affect the pockets of most people. In fact, many of the people who think Donald Trump will save them economically apparently have not heard him say wages are too high. You can go on the internet and see the videos. Don't take my word for it. My book has 44 pages of sources, so you can check everything out in it in the making of Donald Trump. But one of Trump's key points, wages are too high. And as somebody who employs people, why are you surprised that he thinks he pays people too much money? This is a man who spent 18 years fighting to not pay $4 an hour that was owed to illegal immigrants that he hired. It'd be about $12 an hour in today's money. 18 years. And even after a judge found that he had cheated the workers and that he engaged in a conspiracy to cheat these illegal immigrants, about 150 of them, he continued to fight to not pay.
We're talking with Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and author David Cay Johnston. His new must-read book is The Making of Donald Trump. David, let me ask you a little bit about the making part, where he comes from, his family, his father.
Let me go back to his grandfather first, because I think it's highly relevant. Friedrich Trump turned 16 years old in 1885 and became subject to the universal mandatory draft in Germany. So he fled in the middle of the night and came to America, where he followed Horace Greeley's advice. Go west, young man. And he made a fortune in Seattle, in Everett, Washington, and in the Yukon Territory, all places where he ran whorehouses. In one of them, he even built a hotel on land he didn't own, but it wasn't a hotel for sleeping. And he died in the flu pandemic of 1918, left two small children. His son, Fred Trump, was 12 or 13 when he died. Fred Trump was a really industrious guy. When he was 15 years old, he had a business in the outer boroughs of New York. It was owned by his mother, so it was called Elizabeth Christ and Son. And he built garages. He made a lot of money doing that, and by the time that the Great Depression started, he opened one of the first self-service grocery stores. It used to be, the clerks got the food off the shelf for you. He sold it for a good profit because it was a smart business move. During World War II, he built government-financed housing for shipyard workers in Virginia and Pennsylvania. And after the war, Fred Trump was said to be the first person in line to get FHA, Federal Housing Administration, loans to build housing for GIs. Well, the FHA people started looking at his books, and they went and told President Eisenhower that Fred Trump had ripped the government off for $4 million. In today's money, we're talking about roughly 10 times that amount of money, $35 or $40 million. Eisenhower threw a fit in the Oval Office over profiteering off the government in a program to help returning soldiers and sailors. And we know that because 100 federal investigators were put on the case. This is in the 50s. Now, Fred Trump wasn't the only person they went after, but when the Senate held hearings, he was the star witness. And you can see the future Donald Trump as the showman who wants you to see one thing and not pay attention to the real facts. Fred Trump said, you misunderstand what happened here. I'm not a war profiteer. I'm not a profiteer off GIs and the government. It's just, you don't understand. Yes, there's $4 million there, but it's in the bank. I didn't take the money. And hopefully everybody listening is laughing at what a ridiculous argument that is.
Because it's in his bank account?
Oh, yeah. No, it was in his bank account. It was in his business's bank account, not his personal bank account, as if that makes a dime's worth of difference.
But that was his defense. Goodness gracious.
And that's right. And later, Fred Trump wanted to tear down a very popular ride on Coney Island called the Steeplechase. Its icon was a big, funny face of a clown. And there was big public opposition to this, and you can see how Donald Trump learned showmanship from his father. There are pictures in the Brooklyn Eagle in I think it was 1964 when this happened, but whatever the year back then, there are 5 or 6 young women, very, very voluptuous, curvy young women in what for the day would have been considered pretty scandalous swimsuits, handing out bricks to politicians and other dignitaries that they can throw at the face of the funny face to destroy it. So Donald Trump's showmanship didn't come from nowhere. He partly got it from Dad.
David, really quick here, because I want to make sure that we've covered it, is the federal case against the Trumps in the early 1970s. They went after the Trumps again.
In the 50s, Fred Trump was gone after for racial discrimination, and in my book, I have Woody Guthrie's song, because he lived in one of Fred Trump's projects where he writes about the racism of Fred Trump. And Fred Trump was arrested in 1927 in a KKK-pitched battle with New York City police. In the 70s, the federal government, using the Housing Act passed just days after Martin Luther King was murdered, went and did testing. And so they would send a white person or couple, they'd send a black or Puerto Rican person or couple to a building whose finances showed that they qualified to rent. And if they were turned down, then they would send a white person or couple with the same finances. And if they were told, oh, yes, we have a number of apartments that are available, then the government sued you. Well, Donald Trump and his lawyer, the notorious Roy Cohn, he was the attack dog for Senator Joseph McCarthy, they turned around and sued the government, and they held a press conference announcing that the government was trying to force them to take people on welfare. Well, no, the government wasn't doing that at all. It was saying you have to rent to people who are economically qualified. A freshly minted Justice Department lawyer handling what I think was her first case. She's dead now, but if it wasn't, it was within a handful of her first cases. Wiped the floor with Trump and his lawyers, and they settled. And for 2 years, they didn't discriminate. As soon as the agreement not to discriminate ended, the government sent out inspectors again, and imagine what they found. They were right back to coding applications to keep out blacks and Puerto Ricans, and the government went after them again. And Donald Trump has been found repeatedly since then, after proceedings were held, to have discriminated in employment against blacks, women, Asians, and has been fined for this.
You're not surprised then, David, by what we hear from Donald Trump out on the campaign trail, the stuff that makes headlines. You knew right away that if he won this, that this is the kind of stuff we were going to hear from him, because you know him. You know what he's like.
Oh, yeah. First of all, there's a large number of people in America who really hate the civil rights movement, who the idea that they would have to report at work to a black woman or a Latino man, there's a large minority of Americans who they'll do it, but they don't like doing it. They don't want to do it. That's what the whole political correctness argument is about. And Donald has appealed to these people. There are 3 groups of people basically supporting him. One are white males, generally not especially well educated or trained in a very specific field, whose jobs have gone away, partly because of globalization, shipping jobs to China, which is something I've written a lot about, partly because of technology changes, and other fundamental economic changes. I mean, when I was a very young man, I went into a sawmill and watched hundreds of men working and thought, this is an incredibly dangerous place I don't want to be in. The last time I went to see a sawmill, the entire employment of the mill, including the front office, was 8 people, because everything was done with computerized machines. So a lot of those jobs aren't coming back, and these are people who really hurt and have real grievances about government policy and government not doing anything for them. The second group of people are those who hate the civil rights movement, who believe America should be a white Christian nation, even though the founders explicitly rejected that. And the third group are people of faith who have been misled by both Trump and by their pastors. And those are his support groups there. The last group, I think a lot of those people are now questioning what's going on, given Trump's boasts about sexually assaulting women and the women who have come forward. There's 9 have gone public so far. The lawyer for one of them says that a number of others have come to her but are not willing to go public. You remember Bill Cosby, there was one woman, and eventually we got to 50. and who didn't know each other, and yet their stories all seem to line up pretty well.
Yeah.
And just one other story, Coy, that people should know about Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I show in The Making of Donald Trump, has spent his entire life embracing violent felons, convicted swindlers, American mafia, Russian mobsters, and being accused left and right of cheating people, small businesses out of their pay, and investors. But the most important person he dealt with is the guy who supplied his helicopters, a convicted embezzler and mob associate named Joseph Wexelbaum. There were a lot of companies that as a casino owner, Trump could have gone to for helicopters to fly high rollers into his casinos. He went instead with Wexelbaum, who had hardly any financing, went bankrupt twice, stayed with him, even though he went bankrupt. And then Wexelbaum got arrested by the DEA, and it turned out, and he confessed to being a major cocaine trafficker. Now, at this point, Donald Trump should have cut his ties to Joe Wexelbaum because the Casino Control Act in New Jersey requires the owners of casinos to prove by clear and convincing evidence that they do not associate with criminals. Supreme Court has upheld this law, saying casino ownership is a privilege, it's not a right, so the government can have this rule. It's your obligation to prove you're not involved with criminals. Trump wrote a letter pleading for mercy for Joe Wexelbaum, saying he's a credit to the community and describing him as a stand-up citizen, a diligent guy. His case was in Cincinnati, Ohio. The drugs were from Miami to Cincinnati. He asked that it be moved when he agreed to plead guilty to Miami or to New York City, where he lived. He had homes in both cities. Instead, and no one has ever been able to explain this, not the defense lawyer, not the prosecutor, nobody, the case was transferred to New Jersey federal court, where it came before a new judge, Marianne Trump Barry, Donald's older sister. Now, she removed herself 3 weeks later from the case. But imagine, Coy, you're the chief judge of any federal district, and another judge comes down to you and says, listen, I can't handle this case against this confessed trafficker in drugs because my husband flies in his helicopters every couple of days, and I fly in his helicopters frequently. You think that might make you deeply worried about the integrity of the courts and what would happen if this got out into the news?
Yeah.
So anyhow, this letter he wrote, he first denied he wrote it, he tried to lie and cover up, then he admitted that, he wrote it. It worked. Joe Wexelbaum served only 18 months, and you know what the mules who drove the drugs from Miami to Cincinnati got? 20 years. Now, if that doesn't sound like the fix is in, I don't know what does. Furthermore, to get out early, Wexelbaum had to establish that he had a job, and he told his parole officer he did. He was going back to work for Donald Trump handling his helicopters.
Oh, my gosh.
He also had to have a place to live, and he said he had no money to pay the fines that the Judge Ackerman, who sentenced him, imposed on him. Judge Ackerman, by the way, the closest friend on the court of Marianne Trump Barry. He had no money to pay the fines, and yet he moved into a $2.4 million apartment in Trump Tower. Now, I think these are issues that he ought to be asked about all over the place, and I fault my peers in national journalism. At the big papers I used to work for, the New York Times and the LA Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer, why aren't you asking these questions? Why is it that I have talked about this on your show, on the national news networks of Australia, Japan, Canada, England, France, and Germany, but I haven't been on ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS for a Sunday show, edited out every reference to Donald Trump and criminals, every single one? Why is this not being covered? And I think it's not being covered because we had 60% more journalists in this country 16 years ago than we have today, and Trump has threatened to sue everybody in sight, including me, because he doesn't want anybody looking at the actual record of his conduct.
They seem so quick. Journalists seem so quick to want to talk about the latest gaffe or stuff he says about Mexicans or women, but
because it's cheap and easy news. I mean, look, Donald Trump is great for television. If you're a television executive looking at the bottom line, Donald Trump is you know how everybody slows down and rubbernecks and there's an accident? Well, Donald Trump is a wreck with dancing girls and fireworks. People just don't turn away. And that's been very good for these guys, and it's really cheap to cover him. You just take a camera and set it up and let it run. But to go do the work, well, that means you've got to hire journalists who know how to go through public records, who know how to sift through them and test them and check them.
We're talking with David Cay Johnston. His must-read, best-selling new book is The Making of Donald Trump. We'll take a very quick break and continue this conversation in the second half of our program. My guest is investigative journalist and author David Cay Johnston. His new book is The Making of Donald Trump. David, let me ask you about Donald Trump's finances. What's your read on the real numbers? Is he a billionaire? And why hasn't he released his tax returns?
Well, let's start with his net worth. When Donald announced this time back in June of 2015, within a matter of days, he said he was worth $8.7 billion, $10 billion, more than $10 billion, and in one case, $11 billion. Now, I don't know anything going on in the economy, particularly for somebody who's into licensing their name in real estate, that would change the valuations by that much. But I do know what Donald Trump testified under oath when he was asked, how do you determine your net worth? Now, most of us say, well, let's see, I own a house and I own these investments and whatnot, and subtract from that what I owe the bank, and that's my net worth. Donald Trump testified that his net worth is determined by his feelings. It's his emotions. And sometimes he has a good day and he's worth more, and other times he has a bad day and he's worth less. And imagine if the person sitting next to you on the train or the airplane or in a bar were to say this to you. I mean, you'd think they're nuts. It's just nutty. So that's one thing. Two, there's no evidence at all that Trump is a billionaire. He says he's a multi-billionaire. Back in 1990, when I broke the story that his own financial statement showed he wasn't a billionaire, and a subsequent government document 4 months later that he had to enter into the record himself through his attorney showed he had a negative net worth of $300 million. He claimed to be worth $3 billion to me, $5 billion to a TV reporter, and yet he couldn't pay his bills. You ever heard of a billionaire who can't pay his bills? And then thirdly, we've now learned, because of some diligent reporting into his finances by the New York Times, that he has not listed in his presidential campaign form all sorts of overseas involvements. He has hundreds of entities that he is part owner of overseas, and his contention, if he's part owner, he didn't have to disclose them. And he's in debt through one of these entities for $200 million to the Communist government of China through its Bank of China, which is a government-owned bank. Now, just think about that for a minute. Imagine if it had come out that any former president or candidate for president of the United States was in debt to the Communist Chinese government. Imagine if it turned out Mitt Romney had borrowed money from the Communist Chinese government for a project of his, or Barack Obama had a $1,000 credit card from the Bank of China. What would happen? And yet this hasn't hardly had any impact at all in this country. It's astonishing.
To circle back to what we were talking about earlier about the performance of journalists and the media in this year's presidential campaign, I'm sure there will be, many dissertations written in the future and books written about this. How did the journalists do this year? But again, this needs to be added to the list that we need to give props where it's due. Your work, the New York Times. There are journalists out there who literally are doing this work. They get up every day. They comb through the records. They make the phone calls. They make the trips sometimes to talk to sources. And they're doing a really good job at getting this news out there.
But they weren't coy early on. I wrote a piece in July of last year, 21 questions for Donald Trump, and it was aimed at journalists. I said, you should ask him about this. Only 2 of the questions were ever asked. One was asked by Marco Rubio and the other by Ted Cruz. And so, today, when we're less than 4 weeks from the election, journalists are asking, in fact, I guess we're 3 weeks and a day from the election, there are good journalists asking tough questions. This is awful late in the game to be doing this. This should have been done a long time ago. And it wasn't like the journalists didn't know where to go. I mean, I was offering documents and sharing documents with the Washington Post and the Associated Press and Bloomberg and others months and months and months ago that most of them, they didn't really go anywhere with them. The Washington Post has done some very good stories, but frankly, you got to be a pretty high-level reader to grasp the significance of most of those stories.
And again, usually what we get for news is a clip of him speaking and then people talking for an hour about what was he trying to say and can you believe he said it? And...
Right. Right, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. David, what's the takeaway from the Trump University story? Is it just another example of how he does business, that it's a scam?
Well, it's a scam, and it's a particularly troubling one for him. It will not get resolved till after the election. But the Texas Attorney General's Consumer Protection Unit sent agents to, I think it was 57 different gatherings for Trump University. Donald Trump created a video in which he said, Trump University, I will hand-pick the faculty. They will be the best of the best. You will get a better education than at the best business schools, and trust me, I know, because I went to the best business school. Well, first of all, he didn't go to the best business school. He never attended Wharton, which is a graduate school of business. He went to the undergraduate economics program that's in Wharton, but his diploma doesn't say Wharton. It says Penn, University of Pennsylvania. But handpick the faculty and a better education than you could get really at Wharton or Harvard or Stanford Business School, Columbia Business School. That's an astonishing claim. Well, the Texas Attorney General's office found that in the first meeting 3 meetings you paid $1,500 to go to, they stood over your shoulder and said, here's how you get banks to increase your credit lines, and you want to get $35,000 of credit lines so that you can pay full tuition and get the full course from the university. And for many people, the $35,000 was all the money they could borrow. It was their limit. So if you borrowed $35,000 to pay Donald Trump, how are you going to invest in real estate? You have no credit capacity left. Secondly, the Texas Attorney General's office said that what they were teaching in these sessions was contrary to Texas law and wasn't valuable. And in fact, in my book, I point out that one of the things that was sold to people, Donald Trump's secrets on how to borrow money and where to borrow it, I have the same document. I got it for free off the Internet. That's where they got it. And the Attorney General's report, the staff report, points out that Trump had no legal defenses because he had claimed he personally picked the faculty. In fact, when he had to testify under oath, he said he had no idea who the faculty were. He had no role in picking them. They read off the names. They showed him the photographs. He kept saying, why are we doing this? Let's move on. Let's move on. I don't know any of these people. And they were such top people in real estate that one of them was a fast food manager. 2 of them were bankrupt. And most of them had a high school education and were experienced in working in boiler rooms, getting people on the phone to put up money. He didn't have any experts at all. So this is a very serious problem for him after the election. You remember the day he went off on Judge Curiel and said he hates Trump and he's a terrible judge?
Right.
That was the day that Judge Curiel responded to a request by the Washington Post and about 20 other news organizations where they wanted the videotaped depositions of Donald Trump and a bunch of documents Trump had gotten sealed in the 2 federal class action cases against him that are in San Diego, California. The judge actually behaved quite judiciously, in my view, and while I'm not a lawyer, I do teach law at Syracuse University College of Law. I have since 2009. The judge ruled that he would not release the videotapes, but he would release the transcripts. That is, there'd be no videotapes to use for political ads, but the words that he spoke, he would put into the public record. And this is where we find out that Trump had nothing to do with the place and that he had lied through his teeth about this would be, the hand-picked faculty that he would select because he knew the best people, and it was just a lie. Well, under our securities laws, that's fraud. There are no two ways about it. That's fraud. Now, the Texas Attorney General declined to pursue this case, and when Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of Florida, was looking at joining the New York Attorney General's case, Donald Trump, through his charitable foundation, made a campaign contribution to her. You can't use a charitable contribution to make a political contribution. Trump's tax return information, not his personally, but his foundation's, misled the IRS about where the money was from. When they got caught, they came up with a cockamamie story, a very long, shaggy dog story I tell in the book. And finally, they fessed up, and Trump says that he paid a $2,500 fine for this. We don't know if he did or not. We don't know if he was fined. We just know that he says that he paid a $2,500 fine.
My goodness.
By the way, there have been at least 9 illegal acts by the Trump Foundation, which doesn't have any money from Donald Trump in it. It comes from the vendors, like the guy who makes his neckties in China. They're the ones who give to it. And he's used the money to benefit himself. He's used it to pay off legal obligations. He bought 2 paintings of himself, which hang in Trump properties. And by the way, 19 of Trump's properties, casino, restaurants, and the golf courses, if you go, you will see that they are recipients of either the 5-diamond or the 6-diamond award. And the group that gives it says it is the most prestigious award in the world. Not the most prestigious hospitality award, but the most prestigious award in the world. It's bigger than the Nobel Prize to these people. And it turns out that the place is run by a mob guy and a convicted art thief known as Joey No Socks. His name is Joey Sink. And the chairman of the board of the organization, the American Academy of Hospitality Sciences, I think that's the correct name, who signs these awards is one Donald Trump. In other words, Donald Trump gives himself awards.
So, David, can he go to jail for any of the fraud, any of these cases that are cooking, anything about the foundation or Trump University?
Oh, no, he's got huge legal problems. If he becomes president, he's going to be tied up in huge legal troubles. The Doral Country Club down in Florida, which he rehabilitated, he wouldn't pay the Benjamin Moore paint dealer who supplied the paint his last payment of $34,000. And this is very typical of Donald. He'll pay you 50 or 75% of what you're owed, and then he'll say, sue me. I've talked to people who brought him work that they did for him, and he would take it in his hand. He would say, this is absolute crap, I'm not going to use it, and throw it behind his desk. And they would say, well, you got to pay me. And he'd say, sue me. And they'd say, fine, give it back to me. He says, no, I'm not going to give it back to you. And then he would use it. That's why there's over 4,500 lawsuits against him. And in the Doral case, the Benjamin Moore paint dealer, when his lawyers told him, just walk away from it. It's $34,000. It'll cost you a lot more than that to sue. He said, no, we're going after him. He spent $300,000 in legal fees. And so just as Trump wouldn't pay the workers their $4 an hour in full, he wouldn't pay this guy. And a judge finally had Trump's witness put on the witness stand and was asked, why is Trump not paying this bill? His contract says he owes the money. And Trump's manager, who was the witness, testified, quote, Mr. Trump feels he has paid enough. Well, that's not how it works in America. That's not how it works. And so the judge issued a foreclosure order allowing the Benjamin Moore paint dealer to seize the Doral, sell it, get everything he was owed, including his legal fees, and if there's anything left, Trump gets the money. Well, Trump, instead of paying up at that point, he's continuing now to fight the foreclosure order. It's just who he is that Donald cheats people. And by the way, Coy, one other thing we haven't talked about. You remember the big controversy we had earlier this year and last year about transgendered bathrooms, and what do we do about someone who's having their sex changed from male to female, but they haven't had the surgery yet? Can they use the women's bathroom? And there was always concern about, what's going to happen to young women in the bathrooms. Right. Well, Donald Trump walked in on naked 15-year-old and 16-year-old girls at one of the beauty pageants he owns. And he was known for walking in on other beauty pageants into the dressing room where he has absolutely no business being there. Now, where is all the self-righteous concern about this when you have this man walking in on 15-year-old girls who are naked? And what did he say, by the way, according to some of the women? I mean, some of them say, I wasn't there, I didn't see that. But the ones who do, he would say, oh, don't worry, I've seen it all before. This is just atrocious behavior.
And where is
That's
David?
Not surprising to me because I know the man, but the people who adore him, they're not seeing the disconnect here. Even when these things come out, there are a lot of people who want to excuse them away. I've been on the TV and the radio, with a lot of people, and I've had people say, but he never said he sexually assaulted anybody. And I said, go back and listen to the tape with Billy Bush. He absolutely, without naming names, described a crime of sexual assault and said he did it all the time.
So, David, the conservatives in this country, politically now, they have made moral outrage something of a cottage industry for decades now, and yet we're not hearing anything, and not from all of them. There are some who've come forward, and props to them and credit to them. A good friend of mine here in Virginia, Sean Kenney, who's the former director of the Republican Party of Virginia, when Trump got right before Trump got the nomination, Sean came out publicly and said, I will never support him for political reasons and moral reasons, and I will campaign against him. He represents the absolute worst choice that we could make, and I will never support him. So there are some conservatives. There are
some who have done this, but where's Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell? Linda Chavez. And by the way, I'm a registered Republican, okay? Paul Ryan, Linda Chavez, who was Ronald Reagan's head of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission in the 80s, was on TV today. And she said, where are the Republicans who should be discrediting this man and saying he's awful and this is not acceptable? And she said they are doing horrible damage to the Republican Party. And she was asked, well, why? And she said, well, a lot of them are running for re-election, and they're afraid if they dump Trump that voters will turn them out of office. And my answer to that is, I'm sorry, you went along with the party's choice. If you're going to lose office over it, I'm sorry for you, but either you have principles or you're craven here. There aren't two paths about this. And, Barack Obama the other day said, so these people say, gee, I think he does terrible things, and he goes on, and then he says, but I still support him. That doesn't make sense, and that's exactly right. It doesn't make sense. And Linda Chavez is worried that something I said in July of last year may well happen, would transpire. She's afraid this will be the end of the Republican Party. That would not be good for the country. We don't want one-party rule.
Yeah, agreed.
Aristotle said, democracy is to rule and to be ruled in turns. And we need to recognize that one-party rules, that's what you get in police states.
David, what do you make of the narrative that Donald Trump is now championing that to lay the groundwork for the illegitimacy of a Hillary Clinton presidency? That's absolutely atrocious, and it indicates that he has no respect for our republic whatsoever. He's all about Donald, and that's one of the major themes of my book, In the Making of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has no record of public service. There's no record of doing anything for anybody else ever. He's made a few charitable gifts to people he felt sorry for, but compared to his claimed wealth, they're inconsequential. And Donald Trump is about Donald Trump. And he can't deal with the fact that he may lose and lose badly in this election. He's going around saying that there's and Rudy Giuliani with him claiming all this voter fraud, and they cite Pennsylvania. Well, there was actually a lawsuit over voter fraud in Pennsylvania, and the people who brought the lawsuit stipulated, that means they agreed as a matter of law and fact, that there was no voter fraud in Pennsylvania. There was a very good project done by the journalism students at
in Tucson at the University of Arizona, where their leader on this was Len Downey, who for 25 years was either number 2 or number 1 editor at the Washington Post. Know Len very well. A remarkably ethical guy. He didn't even register to vote because he wanted anybody to feel he was influenced on anything political as the editor of the Washington Post. And they found, I think it was 10 possible cases of voter fraud in the entire country over several decades. It's just not there. And yet Rudy Giuliani was saying, oh, yeah, they were buzzing people in and having them vote 7 and 10 times. There's absolutely no evidence of that. In fact, the evidence is that's not true at all. So Trump and the most loyal people to him, they have no compunctions about lying. None at all. Trump's never had... The only time Trump doesn't lie is when he's under oath. You put Trump under oath, and you get different answers. So instead of claiming I'm worth $11 billion, he goes, well, it depends on the mood that I'm in and my feelings and my emotions. By the way, I'm having a pretty good day, Coy. I want you to know I think I'm worth $2 billion today.
So, David, I got a couple minutes left, but let me ask you this. Citizens will go to vote on November 8th. What are the key things that citizens should know about the options that we have to choose our leader in the White House, the leader of the executive branch of our government?
Like it or not, your options are that if you vote for Trump and he's elected, he will be impeached and convicted in just a matter of time because he doesn't understand the duties of the president. He talks about being a dictator, in essence. He's going to tell corporations where they can go. He's going to order U.S. military officers to do things that are illegal. They're going to refuse those orders. I mean, if Donald Trump becomes president, we will quickly have a constitutional crisis. He will be convicted, and we will have a small-town radio talk show host, no insult intended here, as president of the United States, Mike Pence, a man who could not get reelected by his own party if he ran again in Indiana. That's how much he is detested in Indiana. I mean, all the polling is very clear. The Republican leaders, he couldn't get reelected. If you vote for the other candidate, you get somebody who lots of people really dislike, but who, after, 35 years of going after her, or at least 25 years, and hundreds of millions of dollars spent, nobody's ever been able to come up with a single crime, not one. And by the way, I analyzed the giving by the Clintons and the Trumps based on their wealth. And the Clintons literally give it at a rate 1,000 times that if you believe Donald Trump is really worth $10 billion. 1,000 times. That's not an endorsement of her. It's just, you don't have anything on her, and look at all the stuff we got over here from a man who doesn't know what the nuclear triad is, doesn't know under oath basic concepts of finance, doesn't understand Middle East politics. If he were asked in the debate Wednesday night, well, tell us the difference between Shias and Sunnis and how that would be important to our policy in the Middle East, he wouldn't know. If you asked him why is Dabiq important to ISIL or ISIS, he wouldn't know. Dabiq is the city which we just took back from them, where they believe the end of the world is about to happen and Muhammad will come back. If you don't know that, how can you understand who they are and what they're doing? And Trump doesn't know that. He's given answers that make it clear he doesn't understand the most basic things about geopolitics, military strategy, and most surprisingly of all, business finance.
David Cay Johnston is an award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and author. His latest must-read book is The Making of Donald Trump. David, it's always a privilege to have you on this program, sir. Congratulations on the book, and look forward to talking again.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Coy.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.